I told you that one small Caribbean island, inspired Treasure Island, launched a global musical revolution and managed to survive a complete economic collapse not once, but twice? Would you believe me? This is a nation where art and culture take centre stage, and the only thing faster than the music is the pace of its political history. We're heading to the iconic crossroads of the Americas to uncover the full, wild story of Cuba. And you don't want to miss this. Now, before 1492, this incredible island was already home to people with deep roots. You had the Siboney and the Guanahatabey, and then, about 1,000 years ago, the Taíno people, who originated from Venezuela, arrived and became the largest indigenous group. They were here, living their lives, cultivating the land. But that calm was about to be shattered. Because in 1492, Christopher Columbus arrived, and he promptly claimed the island for Spain. But the Spanish conquest officially began in 1511 under the leadership of Diego de Velázquez. He set up the first settlements, like Baracoa, and that's when the whole landscape started to change. The Spanish were on the hunt for gold and other minerals, and they instituted the encomienda system, which essentially forced the Taíno people into slave labour and mandatory Christian conversion. But here's the heartbreaking part. The indigenous population was largely wiped out over the next few decades, not just from Spanish brutality, but mainly from diseases, like smallpox, that the Europeans unintentionally brought with them. It was nothing short of a demographic catastrophe. Now, with the local population decimated, the Spanish turned to a cruel and massive labour source. Beginning around 1526, they started importing hundreds of thousands of African slaves, mainly to work the sugarcane plantations. And this reliance on the sugar trade and African slavery became the defining feature of Cuba's economy and social structure for centuries. And Havana quickly became a vital port and transition site for Spanish trade in the New World, mainly because of its strategic location. So naturally, everyone wanted a piece of the action. In 1762, the British even swooped in and captured Havana, though they gave it back to Spain the following year in the Treaty of Paris. But that's another long story. So let's fast forward to the 19th century, when the real fight for self-determination kicks off. Despite being one of the last places in the world to abolish slavery in 1886, Cuban-born residents, or criollos, were getting tired of Spanish rule. This led to the 10 Years' War of Independence from 1868 to 1878, which ended in a shaky truce and Spanish promises of reform that, well, they mostly failed to keep. Then came the second push for freedom, led by the national hero José Martí, starting in 1895. It's often called the Spanish-American War in US history books, but for Cuba, it was the final war of independence. And in 1898, the US declared war on Spain, defeated them, and Spain finally gave up all claim to Cuba. So in 1902, Cuba officially became an independent republic. Sounds great, right? But there's always a catch with these things. And in Cuba's case, the US had inserted something called the Platt Amendment into the Cuban constitution. This basically gave the US the right to intervene in Cuban affairs whenever they felt like it, keeping the island firmly under US influence and protection. So, Cuban independence at this point was a little like a teenager whose parents still hold the keys to their car. The next 50 years are a cycle of instability, coups, and US interference. The US actually occupied Cuba a few times in the early 1900s. Then, in 1933, Sergeant Fulgencio Batista led a coup and became the power behind the throne, eventually becoming president himself. He had a brutal, oppressive, and incredibly corrupt regime, though the US did give up its right to intervene in 1934. And this set the stage for one of the most famous revolutions in modern history. In 1953, a young lawyer named Fidel Castro led a revolt against Batista. It failed and he was jailed, but the seed was planted. After being released, Castro and his comrades, including the iconic Argentine doctor Ernesto Che Guevara, landed in eastern Cuba from Mexico in 1956 and started a guerrilla war from the Sierra Maestra Mountains. Slowly but surely, they gained popular support. And then on January 1st, 1959, Castro led his victorious 9,000-strong guerrilla army into Havana, forcing Batista to flee the country. Finally, the Cuban Revolution had triumphed. Castro quickly became the prime minister, and his brother his deputy. But like any other change, the revolutionary government immediately started shaking things up, and things got tense with the US real fast. In 1960, all US businesses in Cuba were nationalized without compensation, and by 1961, Washington broke off all diplomatic ties. This was the start of the infamous US embargo that continues in various forms to this day. So Fidel Castro led the country for almost 5 decades until poor health forced him to temporarily hand over power to his brother, Raúl Castro, in 2006, who then officially took over as president in 2008. In a stunning turn of events, President Barack Obama and President Raúl Castro announced moves to normalize diplomatic relations in 2014, leading to the reopening of embassies in 2015. The first time since 1961, can you believe it? Fidel Castro passed away in 2016 at the age of 90, marking the end of an era. The following year, the Trump administration rolled back some of the warming relations. And in 2018, the 6 decades of Castro rule ended when Miguel Díaz-Canel took over as president, a move that brought in a new generation of leadership. All right, history checked. Now let's talk about the incredible stage this drama unfolded on: Cuba's geography. First, some bragging rights. Cuba is the biggest country on the Caribbean bloc. Along with islands like Jamaica and Hispaniola, it's part of the Greater Antilles island chain. But despite this, geologically, it's considered part of North America, which is something most people don't realise. But I digress. Going back, Cuba is a long, thin country that covers about 110,900 square kilometres, or nearly 43,000 square miles. And it's surrounded by neighbours like Florida, the Bahamas, Haiti and Jamaica. So you could say it's at the crossroads of the Americas. If you drive across the island, you'll see a mix of scenery. About 3/5 of Cuba is made up of flat, fertile plains, perfect for growing those world-famous tobacco and sugarcane crops. But if you head east, the flatlands give way to drama. The most rugged and famous range is the Sierra Maestra. These mountains are legendary, because remember the revolution? This was the guerrilla bastion for Fidel Castro and Che Guevara. It's also home to Cuba's highest point, Pico Turquino, towering up to 1,974 metres, or 6,476 feet. The main island is surrounded by over 4,000 islands, and cays that make up 4 major archipelagos. The most famous one is the Jardines de la Reina, or Gardens of the Queen, often called the Galapagos of the Caribbean. And another archipelago is home to the Isle of Youth, which, fun fact, is famously rumoured to have inspired the setting for Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island. How cool is that for a travel stop? Which begs the question, what's the weather here like? Well, Cuba is a classic tropical paradise, warm all year round. The best time to visit is the cool, dry season from November to April, where you get mild, perfect temperatures, around 25 degrees Celsius or 77 degrees Fahrenheit. But be warned, the hot, wet season, which is from May to October, brings intense heat and humidity. And of course, that includes hurricane season. Though tropical storms are a real threat, Cuba is renowned globally for its safety protocols, keeping people safe during the worst weather. But outside its picture-perfect facade and paradise ideology, the reality is, Cuba isn't doing so well economically. First up, the political system. At its core, Cuba is a socialist, one-party state led by the Communist Party of Cuba, or the PCC. You have a legislature, the National Assembly, but the PCC is the main power centre. Since Fidel died in 2016 and Raúl Castro stepped away from his final official post in 2021, the country has been in this post-Castro era under President Miguel Díaz-Canel, and he's trying to keep the revolutionary principles intact while the whole system is creaking under massive pressure. And that pressure brings us to the economy. This is where the story gets really dramatic, because back in 2014, when the Obama administration opened up diplomatic relations with Cuba, there was real hope, and the GDP jumped by a healthy 5% in 2015. Everyone thought, here we go. But since the US rolled back some of those measures and internal reform stalled, things have spiraled downhill. Experts are now calling this the worst crisis in Cuba's entire independent history, worse than the special period after the Soviet Union collapsed in the 90s. And the government is calling this a war economy, trying to rally people to the cause, but the numbers are brutal. The country's GDP, which was around $107.35 billion in 2020, is shrinking. In 2025, the projected GDP is around $26.72 billion. The UN Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, or ECLAC for short, estimated the GDP fell by negative 1.9% in 2023, and they're predicting a further decline of around negative 1.5% in 2025. Think about that. The Cuban economy has shrunk cumulatively by more than 11% in just the past 5 years. It's a huge contraction. This crisis hits everyone right where they live, primarily through two things: inflation and poverty. The official inflation rate, which was a wild 77.3% at the end of 2021, settled at nearly 39% in 2023. And when prices are rising that fast, people simply can't keep up, even with pay adjustments. This is why you hear that heartbreaking statistic. Extreme poverty reached 88% in 2023, and reports suggest 7 out of 10 Cubans have had to cut out a main meal because they can't afford food. It got so bad that the government had to ask the UN World Food Programme for financial aid just to distribute milk to children under 7. And when you look at the major industries, you see the collapse clearly. Tourism, a huge hard currency earner, has fallen by nearly 50% since 2017. And traditional exports are crashing. Foreign sales of sugar fell by a devastating 82%, and nickel was down 32%. On top of that, the infrastructure is failing. Daily, hours-long blackouts are common because electricity generation capacity dropped by 25% between 2018 and 2022. And in 2025, emergency crews were working to restore power to 10 million people in September, which was the 5th blackout in less than a year. Now, while the embargo is one of the reasons for these struggles, economists agree that chronic internal issues like currency mismanagement and state monopolies have also played a massive role. So the consensus is clear: Cuba needs major structural reforms to climb out of this hole. It's a nation struggling, trying to survive day to day against immense economic odds. But now that we have the serious stuff out of the way, let's dive into the incredible culture of Cuba. Sound good? Alright, so if Cuba's spirit were a dish, it would be a blend of Spanish and African roots, seasoned with the political fire of the revolution. And you'll see that blend everywhere, especially in the art. The government, particularly through the Ministry of Culture established in 1976, plays a huge role in the arts, because before 1959, most cultural centres were privately run and mostly limited to Havana. Today, that system has been radically decentralised. Cuba now boasts around 400 libraries and 217 museums spread all over the country, and they run a fantastic programme of arts education. They even have neighbourhood cultural centres offering workshops in everything from music to painting. The idea is to make culture a right, not a privilege, which I think every country should do. So, zooming in, Cuban artists and writers have always been rebels and storytellers. In literature, the concept of freedom gained serious intensity with writers like José Martí in the 19th century, inspiring the fight for independence. Post-revolution, the island produced figures like Alejo Carpentier and the poet José Lezama Lima. Though many world-class authors like Guillermo Cabrera Infante and Reinaldo Arenas ended up in exile due to political censorship, their voices remain crucial to the Cuban story. Fun fact: Ernest Hemingway is deeply admired here, as he called the island home for many years and set classics like The Old Man and the Sea right here. In the visual arts, Cuban painters like Wilfredo Lam and René Portocarrero are national treasures. And because the Ministry of Culture provides materials and guarantees jobs to art school graduates, Cuban artists often work across genres, designing fabrics, stage sets, and posters. Speaking of Cuban posters, with their bold designs for films and cultural events, are actually one of the country's best-known cultural exports. Plus, events like the Havana Biennial, which started in 1984, have made Havana a global hub for promoting art from the developing world. And if you've ever heard Cuban music, you know it's impossible to stand still. That unique fusion of Spanish melody and African rhythm has birthed genres that have shaped the entire Western Hemisphere. the rumba, son, guaracha, danzón, cha-cha, and of course salsa. That's why learning to dance is simply a Cuban tradition. It's a celebration of heritage, mixing native African moves with Spanish-influenced music. For music lovers, the biggest story recently was the worldwide success of the Buena Vista Social Club album and documentary in the late 1990s, which revived the careers of legendary artists like Ibrahim Ferrer and Omar Portuondo, and introduced that incredible, warm, classic Cuban sound to a new global audience. And if you like social commentary mixed with beautiful melody, listen to Pablo Milanés and Silvio Rodriguez, founders of the Nueva Trova, or New Song movement. So I know we've tackled a lot about Cuba, so I'm curious to know which aspect of its story, from its revolutionary history to its economic crisis to its infectious culture, do you think defines the country most today? Or perhaps, if you've ever been to Cuba, what's one memory or experience that stands out the most to you? Let me know in the comments below. And as always, if you enjoyed this video, you'll love this next one.